Welcome to another pumpkin pattern tutorial video. This is my garter pumpkin pattern and it is by far the easiest. I have made this video with beginners in mind, so I'll teach you how to cast on, work a basic knit stitch, and how to create this pumpkin with all the seaming and stuffing that you need. It's worked entirely in garter, so it's very simple, and I will walk you through every single step in this video. In terms of materials, you can use any yarn and needles that you want. You pick a yarn and find a pair of needles that work well with it. You want the knit stitches that you create to work up neatly and not loosely. If they're too loose, you'll be able to see the stuffing through the knitting. So it doesn't have to be tightly knit, just neat enough it doesn't have big gaps between the stitches. My sample uses I Love This Yarn from Hobby Lobby in a set of US 8 5mm needles. You also need a yarn needle and some stuffing. You do not have to follow a gauge for this pattern, but if you do, just keep in mind that your gauge will stretch out a lot when you stuff your pumpkin, and the sizing will greatly depend on the yarn and needles you use and how much stuffing you put in your pumpkin. This pattern is worked sideways, so you cast on an amount, you work however many rows you want to create the circumference of your pumpkin, and then you bind off, and then you sew the two sides together. So the height of your pumpkin is determined by how many stitches you cast on, and the circumference around your pumpkin is determined by how many rows you knit. So if you're choosing a cast on with no gauge, you can just cast on however many stitches you want, just cast on until you like the height of it. I recommend knitting one row just to see how that knits up for you. It can be an odd or even number. And then when it comes to choosing a cast on, if you know your gauge, you can pick a circumference size for your pumpkin at its widest point. Take your row gauge per 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters and multiply it by the circumference of your pumpkin that you want, and that will give you the rows to knit. You'll want this to be an even number of rows to knit. You could also do odd, but it will look better when you're seaming it if you do an even number of rows. Secondly, you're going to pick a height for your pumpkin. Remember, it will cinch a little bit at the top and the bottom. Take your stitch gauge per 1 inch, 2.5 centimeters, multiply it by the height of your pumpkin, and that will give you your cast on amount. So I've made this pattern with beginners in mind. So I'm going to teach you how to cast on in the most beginner friendly way. So you're going to take your needles, and I'm using circulars, but you can use straight needles. It doesn't matter. The process is exactly the same either way. So you need to make a slip knot. If you know how to do that, go ahead and make one. If you don't, lay your yarn in an upside down U so that the tail is over here. Take the top, twist it so it creates a loop. Now fold it down so it looks like a pretzel, right? Now this left piece here, we're going to pull up. So you can kind of hold down the other pieces and pull this one up. And there you go. So here I have my slip knot. I'm just going to slip it onto my left needle. And then you can pull on both ends to kind of tighten it up. Now you don't want it to be super tight. Okay, see how I have some space here? So I could stick my needle through that hole very easily. So now we're going to work our cast on. So for me, I'm going to cast on 26 stitches. So I'm going to kind of visualize this for you real quick if you've never knit a stitch before. So here is my needle, right? And I have my slip knot on it, okay? Do you see how there's a front loop and a back loop? Okay, one that's closest to me and one that's furthest away. Okay, so there's a hole that the loop creates. So we're going to stick our right needle into that hole, just grabbing that front loop here. Now I'm going to show that to you on our needle. So there is that hole. This is the front loop. This is the back loop. So you're going to take your right needle, go into that hole, and it will crisscross your needles with your left on top of your right. It should look like this from all angles. Then take your yarn that is attached to the ball of yarn, and you're going to yarn over from front to back over that right hand needle. And now what we're going to do is we're going to pull this loop here that we've just placed on our right hand needle through the hole of this first slip knot stitch, right? Try and show it to you as best I can. So I like to hold on to this yarn over string here on our right needle with my index finger. So we take our right needle and holding that stitch with our index finger, pull the tip of our right needle back through that stitch, okay? So now you should have a loop on your left needle and on your right, and you can go ahead and pull that loop up a little bit with your right needle. Now we do not want to just place it back on our left needle like this. So instead, we want to twist it. So bring our left needle closer to us and then into the hole on our right hand needle. and then you can pull on the working yarn, the one attached to your ball of yarn, to kind of tighten up that stitch. You don't want to pull tight, you want it to be able to slip down your needle with ease. So we had our slip knot to begin with, and then you just cast on one stitch. So you're just going to repeat that process. So go into the front loop only, bring the working yarn from your ball of yarn over the right needle from front to back, hold it with your index finger, use the needle to guide that yarn over through the hole. Okay, so now you have one stitch on your right hand needle. Pull it up a little bit, and now we need to place it on our left hand needle. But remember, we need to twist it. So bring our left needle closer to us and go through the hole of that stitch on your right hand needle. Okay, so you've just slipped it, and now you can pull on the working yarn to even it up. So they should all be about the same size. Remember not to pull too tightly, and that's it. That's your cast on process. So go ahead and do that until you have as many stitches as you need. If for some reason after you've gotten the stitch on your right hand needle, if you drop it by accident, it's okay. Just pull on the working yarn and it will undo it, and you can start again. Once you have your desired cast on amount, we can go ahead and knit our first row. So the process for this is very similar to our cast on actually. So go into the front loop of the first stitch, the stitch that is closest to the tip of your needle. So go into the front loop of it like we've been doing. Yarn over from front to back, and then you guide that yarn through the stitch on our left hand needle, right? So the difference now from casting on to actually knitting is that you're going to slide that first stitch on your left hand needle off of the needle. So you can just go ahead and slide it to the tip and then push it off. So we've basically just transferred it from our left needle to our right needle. And that is all that knitting is you add an extra loop and you transfer it from one needle to the next. So you just do that again, go into the front loop of the next stitch on your left hand needle, yarn over from front to back, guide the yarn through, and then slide that off your left hand needle. And that's it. That's all there is to basic knitting. I'm holding my yarn in my last few fingers on my left hand, tightest with the bottom two fingers and then looser with my middle finger. And then I bring my index finger underneath that yarn. And I kind of hold tension with my index finger to get that to not move. So after a while, I don't have to use my index finger to hold that yarn. I just keep the tension tight with my left finger, pull it through, and then slide it off. But you could also hold the yarn in your right hand. So you would go into the front loop, bring the yarn around from front to back, and pull a loop through, and then slide that stitch off your left hand needle. So again, into the front loop, bring the yarn around from front to back, pull a loop through, slide off, whichever way you prefer. So you just go ahead and do this all the way down the row until you have no more stitches on your left hand needle and they've all been transferred to your right needle. It should look like this. No more stitches on my left needle and they've all moved to my right needle. I need to make my right needle my left needle. And how you do that is you just turn it around. You just take your work and you just turn it. So your yarn should be in front of your work now. We want it to be in the back because we're knitting. So you bring it around your needle to the back. And I like to scooch my stitches up towards the end, towards the tip of the needle. And we just repeat what we did last row. Okay, so just go into that front loop of that first stitch on our left needle and crisscross them. Yarn over from front to back. Use your needle to guide that loop through the hole. And then slide that stitch off your left hand needle. Okay, so you just do that all the way across again. And that's really the whole process. You knit all the way across and then you turn your work again like we just did. That's the entire process of this pumpkin until we get to the very end where we seam it together. So you just knit until your piece is as long as you want your pumpkin to be around. So go ahead and knit as many rows as you want. I suggest keeping a tally of how many rows you've worked. If you lose track, it's okay. Will just look a little bit less neat if you work an odd number of rows, but it won't be very noticeable. And since this is decoration, you're most likely going to have it on a shelf where you can hide that seam in the back. So you want to work an even amount of rows total, but if you lose count or you haven't been counting at all, that's totally okay. An easy way to remember this, when you're ready to bind off, here I am with the working yarn attached to my right side. Okay, I'm ready to bind off. If I go all the way down, my tail should be on the right side, the same as my working yarn. Okay, they both are attached to the right half of my work. So now I'm going to teach you how to bind off. This is a very simple standard knit bind off. You're just going to knit the first 2 stitches. So remember how we did that? We go into the front loop, crisscross our needles, so it should look kind of like this, and then bring the yarn from front to back over our right hand needle. And you want to hold on to it a little bit. And if you need to, you can put your index finger on that yarn on your right hand needle and guide that piece of yarn through the stitch on your needle. Slide that stitch off your left hand needle and do that one more time. So into the front loop of the next stitch, bring the yarn around from front to back over our right hand needle. Hold it with your index finger if you need and kind of guide it through the stitch on your left hand needle. Now slide that stitch off your left hand needle. So now we're going to bind off our first stitch. So we have 2 stitches on our right hand needle. We have our first stitch that we knit here and then our second stitch here. We're going to take our left hand needle. We're going to go into the front loop of this first stitch here from left to right. You know how we have 2 loops on our needle, right? A front loop and a back loop. We're going to go only into the front loop. So take your needle from left to right and just slide that front loop onto it. And now you're going to hold on to that stitch with your thumb, hold on to the other stitch with your index finger, and we're going to pull the stitch that's on our left hand needle over this stitch here and off. So kind of guide it up towards the tip of your right hand needle and pull this first stitch here over and off. Okay, and then you can slide it off your left hand needle. So I'll show that to you again. So knit the next stitch, go into the front loop of it, yarn over from front to back, pull a loop through, slide that stitch off your left hand needle. So now we're going to take our left hand needle and go into this first stitch here from left to right, just into the front loop. Okay? So you're only picking up one loop, and hold it with your thumb if you need to. Hold the other stitch with your index finger, slide them both down to the tip of your right hand needle and pass this first stitch over the second and off. We passed it over. Now slide it off your left hand needle. And you're just going to keep doing that. Now if you find it easier, you could just take a couple fingers, pull it over and off. It's the same concept, we're just using our needle. So every time you have 2 stitches on your right hand needle, you pull one over and off. If you find it easier to use your hand instead of your needle, that's totally okay. But it's the same process. We just go into the front loop from left to right, pull it over and off. So you just keep doing that all the way down. You don't want to pull tight on these stitches because it will take your bind off and cinch it. So don't knit super tight or anything. Just be pretty gentle when holding the yarn that you don't pull tightly. So we've gotten down until we have 1 stitch on our right hand needle and 1 on our left. Just knit the final stitch. Pull the first over the second and off. And now we only have 1 more stitch, right? So you can kind of just pull a loop up a little bit for now and take your needles off. And now we need to cut a yarn tail. And our yarn tail is going to be used to sew these 2 edges together. So it needs to be at least twice the width of your bind off here. You'll also be sewing through this edge as well. Just to be safe, also about twice the length here. Here's 2 with a little bit of extra. Here's 2 there. So I always like to give myself a couple of extra inches just to be safe. I'll probably end up with, at least a foot of extra length at the end, but I'm not really hurting for yarn and I'd rather be safe. What you can do is you can take this loop that was our final stitch and just pull on it so that it just continues to make the loop bigger until your tail yarn pulls through. Okay, should look like this. So here I have my bind off edge and here I have my cast on edge. So I'm going to fold them in towards the middle. So you want your bind off tail to be attached to the bottom right and your cast on tail to be attached to the top left. So we're going to go ahead and turn our work 90 degrees. Bind off edge, cast on edge. So if we look closely, we have a line of V's. You can see our line of V's here that go like this. There's going to be another row of them that go like this. So if we kind of pull the bind off edge away from our last row a little bit, so I'll isolate just one. Do you see that? It looks like this. That is what we're going to be going underneath both legs of it. Okay, so the right leg and the left leg, and we're going to go underneath a V on this side and then a V on this side and just go back and forth. First, we want to attach our yarn to our cast on edge, the edge closest to us. So if we pull our cast on edge away, you can also see some V's. I'll display one for you. Okay, looks like that. We're just going to go into the corner. As close to the edge as you can. They're a little bit hard to tell, but I have 2 loops here. And I'm just going to go in through the bottom and out through the top, pull my yarn through to kind of join my sides in the beginning. So we have those V's, right? And they have a wider part at the top and then they narrow down towards the point. We want to go underneath with our needle and pick that stitch up. So if we look where our yarn is coming out of, there's a V right here, okay? Do you see it? Comes down to a point here. We go underneath both bars of that from right to left, pull your yarn through. And then come down to the other side. Do you see where our yarn is coming out of here? We're going to go back through that hole and pick up 2 bars. So now we have 2 bars underneath our needle like this. Go underneath, pull that through, and now go up to the top. Do you see where our string is coming out of right here? Stick your needle back through that and pick up the next 2 bars. You see the V? We're underneath both legs of it. This is where the last mattress seam went through. From right to left, pull through. Do you see where our string comes out here? Stick your needle back into that hole and pick up the bars to the left of it, okay? So we have 2 bars underneath our needle. Pull through. Go back to the top. This is our last piece from our seam. So wherever that's coming out of, which is right here, stick your needle in that hole, go to the left, and pick up the next 2 bars. Okay, pull through, and you just keep doing that. So go down, find where your yarn came from, pick up the next 2 bars. Pull through, go to the top. Our yarn came from here, so we go back through there, underneath the next 2 bars. Pull through, and you just do that all the way across. If for some reason you need to undo it, you can just take it off your yarn needle and you can just find where your last seam stitch was and pull it out all the way and just do that until every single one is pulled out. This does not have to be perfect. If yours is not perfect at the end, that's okay. Half the time my seams don't look perfect either. But honestly, people who aren't knitters aren't going to notice. Okay, we're getting close to the edge now. This is what it looks like when we have not pulled it closed. So again, this is where our yarn came from. If you need to, you can kind of pull it loose so that you can find it. Go through that hole, pick up the next 2. It can be a little tricky towards the end, but there we go. Pull through, and then we go through on the bottom, and it came out of, so you can see that this is where our last seam came out of. So we go underneath the next 2 available bars. Now if you have a gap in the end, you can always go back up through the top and complete it. And now it should look like this. I'm going to pull on my tail yarn and it should kind of crinkle and look like this. Okay, don't freak out, you didn't mess it up. Just find one side and another and pull them apart. Should look something like this. So now that we've closed that side, right, whatever side is still attached to your yarn needle, we are going to close that top of the pumpkin. We're actually going to tie a quick knot before we seam the other side of our pumpkin. So just go into a neighboring stitch or a loop, but don't go all the way through. When you have a loop here, go through the loop, pull your yarn. And we do that because we're about to cinch this top of your pumpkin closed, and when you pull it tight, you don't want to accidentally do that to our mattress seam. Okay, we want this to be done. So now you're going to go through a loop here along the edge. We have a loop here, but then we also have one on the edge, right? It's our very edge stitch, so it's kind of on the front and the back side. You don't have to exactly go through that loop. You know, if you can't really tell which one's which, or you would rather go through an easier one, totally do that. Just make sure that whichever you do is as close to the edge as you can get, and you're consistent with it. So if you go underneath like this one here, make sure to do that in all of them. Pull your yarn through, go through a few more. Once you've done like a third of your pumpkin, you can go ahead and cinch some of it. Just pull on the yarn and keep going. So once you get back to where you started, you can go through one final stitch and you're ready to pull it closed. Go ahead and pull on the yarn, but you just want to get it as closed tight as you can, but be careful not to snap your yarn. So this is why we pulled tight in increments, okay? So after every third of your stitches, you pulled a little bit tight. That's about as close as I'm going to get, and that's okay because I'm going to be inserting an I-cord that will cover whatever hole is left. So stick your needle through that hole, turn your work inside out, pull that tail through. So mine loosened up just a little bit when I did that, so I'm going to pull tight again. You're going to take your needle and you're going to go in a circle around that hole. So what we're trying to do is get it to remain closed. So my yarn's attached on the left side here, so I'm going to go on the right and just keep going around in a circle, going underneath some of these stitches here and pulling tight after each time. Doesn't have to be a lot of rhyme or reason to this. You just go under a few stitches, pull yarn, pull tail, okay? Just keep going around in a circle. Sometimes I go under stitches that are closer to the gap, and other times I go, you know, a little bit more in. And you just want to go around the circle once or twice until you feel like your tail yarn is secure. And I was actually able to close it a lot more by doing this. So after I go through a couple stitches, I pulled tight, and I just kept doing that a couple times around the circle. And I was able to actually fully cinch that hole closed. There's the tiniest gap, like I could still stick my needle through it if I needed to. So you're actually done with this tail. You can cut your yarn. It doesn't have to be super short or anything because this is the inside of our pumpkin. You won't even see it. And this is actually my cast on tail that I cut as well. So now you can go ahead and turn your pumpkin right side out again. This is the top of it. So right now I'm going to show you how to make an I-cord, and then I will show you how to attach the I-cord before we do our final bit of seaming. So to begin, you'll need to have a pair of either circulars or double pointed needles. Using whatever method you prefer, go ahead and cast on 3 stitches. If you're attaching the I-cord to something, you'll want to leave yourself a tail to attach it. So normally when you would work something flat, you would turn your work, right? We're not going to do that. We're going to take our stitches and slide them down to the end of our other needle if you're working on circulars, or the end of your same needle if you're working on DPNs. So if you'll notice, the yarn is attached to our 3rd stitch on our left hand needle. That is exactly where we want it to be attached. So now we're just going to knit across the row normally. So knit the 1st stitch normally, go into the front loop of it, crisscross your needles, and bring that yarn over your right needle from front to back. Pull a loop through and slide that stitch off your needle. Now the important aspect of this is that you need to pull on your working yarn after you knit that stitch to kind of close any gap that you would get. It doesn't have to be super tight. If you can't knit the 2nd stitch easily, then you have pulled it too tight and you just need to pull up on the stitch on your right hand needle, okay? So pull it tight enough that you're going to close the gap behind it, and then just knit the next 2 stitches. And you don't have to pull tight after these 2. And once you're done with that, we're just going to slide it down again. The important thing about an I-cord is that you never turn your work. You just slide it down so that your working yarn is attached to the last stitch on your needle now. And you just repeat the row I just showed you. So knit the 1st stitch. A tip that I find helpful is after you knit your 1st stitch, you go ahead and insert your needle into the second stitch and then you pull your yarn tight. That way you know you'll be able to fit your needles in, and then you yarn over, pull through, and slide off. And that's it. You just repeat that until you're ready to bind off. So your I-cord should start to look like this. There's no right side or wrong side to this. So when you get done with your final row and you're ready to bind off, go ahead and slide them all the way down to the end of the other needle, the same way that we have been doing. Now you can bind off any way that you prefer, but I'm going to show you a standard knit bind off. So this is almost identical to what we've been doing, but knit the first stitch. Don't forget to pull tight afterwards, and then knit the second stitch. And now we're going to pull this first stitch over the second and off. So with your left needle, go into the front loop of this first stitch. You might want to hold it with your thumb and then hold this other stitch with your index finger. And you're going to pull this first stitch over the other and off your needle. And you've just bound off one stitch. So we need to do that one more time. Knit one and do the same thing. Go into the front loop of this first stitch from left to right, hold it with your thumb, hold this one with your index, pull it up and over. Now you can cut your yarn, leaving a tail as long as you need, and then you can just lift your right needle up, pull that stitch out. Now this looks kind of sloppy, doesn't it? So I'm going to thread our bind off tail onto a yarn needle. I'm just going to kind of tidy this up. It doesn't have to be perfect, but I want it to look a little bit better. And the nice thing about this, since we're sewing it onto our pumpkin, is if you like the cast on edge better, have that be the side that shows. So I'm just going to kind of thread this through a couple of the stitches. You just want to be careful that when you're threading your yarn through, that you do not go back through where this yarn is coming out of, because you will undo your last stitch. We have this nasty loop hanging out here. I'm just going to thread through a couple of them, kind of pull it closed. Once you've kind of closed up any gaps at the top and you want to hide this, you can kind of just thread it through the middle. See how you can't see the needle on any side? You're just threading it through kind of the center of your I-cord. You can kind of just pull it down through the bottom, or as close to the bottom as you can get. Pull the yarn through, and if it starts to bunch up, just pull it out to even it. Then you can cut that tail close, and it's hidden on the inside of your I-cord. Now you can use your other end to attach your I-cord to whatever it is that you need it for, or you can also do the same thing and just weave it back in. So now we're ready to attach our I-cord. This one looks different than the tutorial I just showed you, but the concept is exactly the same. I just made one that's a little bit smaller. So here we have the right side of our work, the one that's going to show on the outside. I'm going to take my yarn needle that's threaded with the tail, the cast on tail of my I-cord, and I'm going to stick it through that hole, pull through, and I can flip it over towards the wrong side of my work, but pull that I-cord so it's flush with the other side. And we're going to do virtually what we did with our other tail and just go around a circle. You don't have to pull tight after each time. So once I've gone around in a circle, only really about one time is necessary. Mine isn't feeling super secure, it feels very loose. So I'm going to go from the wrong side, go back through the hole in the middle, and I'm going to go up through another section of the I-cord, pull through, making sure that you've caught a piece of your I-cord, go back through the hole, pull it a little bit so that it's secure, and then continue around the closed hole again. Now I'm probably going to do that once or twice again just to make sure that my I-cord is really properly attached. And once you feel like your yarn is secure in there, you can go ahead and cut it. We can turn it so the right side is facing out. And it's time to stuff it. So I have a bunch of polyfill here, and I'm just going to start stuffing my pumpkin. This is totally up to your personal preference, how full you want your pumpkin to be. But I kind of push it down towards the top to make sure that the top is nice and full. So remember, when you cinch in the bottom, it's going to pull that nice and closed. I'm going to give myself a little bit of room here at the bottom. And you're going to take a little bit of yarn, 3 times the circumference of this here at least. So I actually have plenty of leftover tail from my bind off tail. So I'm just going to thread that through a yarn needle. Find your mattress seam. So remember, on the inside it looks like this. So I'm just going to go from the wrong side to the right side. Leave yourself a little bit of a tail. You can either tie these two together, or you can take your needle and repeat that same step, going underneath your new yarn. Don't pull it all the way closed, so you have a circle here, and you can just thread your needle through that, and that will have created a knot. So remember how we seamed our other end closed? We're going to do that exact same thing with this. You can just kind of tuck that tail in because we've created a knot. You don't need it anymore. So remember, just be consistent. Whichever of these loops that you went through, just be consistent and do it with all the other ones around. And I like to pull through as I go. Remember to keep cinching it tight as you're going around. Once you get back to the beginning, I like to go through that beginning stitch again and then just cinch it as closed as you can. Now be careful not to snap your yarn, but we're gonna do something similar to what we did at the top. I'm just gonna weave in my ends around here, and after I go under a few stitches, I'll pull it tight and it should eventually close. Pick some stitches to go under, pull your yarn through, pull tight. Spin a little bit and keep going. So I've only done that twice, and you can already see that the hole has closed up a lot, and just keep doing that until you feel like the bottom is fully securely closed. So this is the final one, I think. So I'm going to pull my yarn through, pull it tight, and I can cut my yarn close to the bottom without hitting any other stitches. That's what the bottom looks like. It looks nice and neat, actually. So now my pumpkin got a little bit squished as I was trying to close the bottom, so I'm just going to try and reshape it a little bit. This might not look enough like a pumpkin to you, so what we can do if you want, this is totally optional. If you don't want to, then you're fully done. You can call it a day and you're done. Use this decoration. But if you want, you see how I have this really tiny, cute mini pumpkin? This was my test version. And to give it a little bit more character, I actually attached a string around it in just random spots to give it more of a real pumpkin feel. But if you want to, cut a long piece of the yarn that you used. This really just depends on the size of the pumpkin that you have. It doesn't have to be any real procedure to this, but if you've ever tied a bow around a present or a ribbon around a present, so this is the middle of my tail, okay? I'm going to place it just next to the Icord stem, flip my pumpkin over, come down to the bottom, so then you can pull one tail underneath, kind of tying them, and then where the character comes from, so you pull a little bit, and this is up to your preference, just depends how much of a ridge you want. So if you want it to be really ridged, you'll pull pretty tight. And now I just kind of turn it a little bit. So I'm catching a different area, and again, you probably want your yarn to go in between your garter ridges. See, in between them. Flip it over, bring your yarn up, tie it again. So bring one over and through, pull tight, turn it again, flip over, and this will probably be my last, but I'm going to again tie a loose knot. So wrap this one around, pull. So I'm going to cut my tails a little bit shorter since I know I'm done, and it's just a little bit easier to manage. I'm going to pull as tight as I want them to be, and then tie another knot to secure this better. So what you can do at the top if you don't like the way it looks is you can kind of pull the fabric up in between. That's in between your pieces of yarn so that it kind of hides it. Just kind of pull it up a little bit. So I'm going to make sure that this is extra secure. Tie another knot, pull it tight, and then you just thread each tail through and just hide it. So go under like that, pull through, and then I can cut my tail. Do it with the other side, and this is what my pumpkin looks like. So I actually like this a lot more. If you put this on a shelf a few feet away from you, you will barely, if at all, see the yarn in between. And if you really don't want to see it, you got to pull really tight, and the fabric will just kind of fold around it and give you this really like knobbly look. Okay, so I really like this actually because it made the polyfill kind of pull in different areas and gives it this really irregular shape that's super unique. So I like this a lot actually. I think I'll be making many more of these because unlike how perfectly round this one is, even though I love it, I still think this is a really great one. This one has way more character. So I really, really like this with the yarn kind of pulled through to give it that really irregular knobbly look, but it is optional. If you just prefer like a normal, this actually looks way more like a pineapple. but if you prefer just a normal pumpkin, that's totally okay. These can both be made with this pattern. So I hope you guys enjoyed this pattern. If you did, please leave a thumbs up and a comment, and I hope to see some of your projects out in the wild. Happy Halloween and happy fall.